seen such a fog or a chill like this.
Keep moving there.
Yes, Mr. Wilson.
Oh!
Mr. Wilson? Mr. Wilson? Mr. Wilson? Jake! Jake, don't leave me! Don't leave me, Jake! Don't go away, Jake! Help me! Help me, Jake! Help me!
We will destroy the living. We will destroy the living.
Welcome to the 8th episode of Tales from the Final Day. It's been just 4 days of Pedro's survival, and he's finally found other survivors at the refugee center. But although he may feel safe, he hasn't come close to winning my survival challenge, which is completed once he's lasted a full month. And so at best there's still many more dark days ahead for Pedro. Over the remaining in-game weeks, more zombies will evolve. Some will even evolve to their second or third evolution by the month's end, as per my difficulty settings. So while Pedro may seem like he's well off, it's still very early. He'll have to keep up the pace to stay afloat as the rotting tide rises. Underneath all my narrative storytelling is still a game, and there remains a heavy chance that Pedro will die an unavoidable death. Pedro is my favorite CDDA survivor, and he's reaching a lot of my goals at a record pace. Compared to last season, where 8 episodes took us through to the completion of the month, Pedro is a much more detailed story. I'm positioned to continue this story for another 2 years if necessary, as there's no game that scratches the apocalypse survival itch quite like Cataclysm. But I'm sure that once I dig into construction or vehicle mechanics, time will start to pass by much faster, as we transition from the intense split-second combat of the first days to the marathon survival of the weeks ahead. So either way, I'm still planning to bring Pedro through to the end. If he dies, it'll be truly heartbreaking, and something I'm avoiding as much as possible. I can't recommend enough writing and recording a series such as this. I've become attached to Pedro. He's become a true character realized by the imagination of his thoughts, feelings, actions, and hopes. Next time you play Cataclysm, if you haven't already, consider writing a personal survival journal, and even posting it to the Cataclysm forums for others to enjoy. Writing adds another layer of enjoyment to the game, and I'm sure you'll look at the game over screen differently. One last thing. It's such a joy to make a series like this because even though I detail the story, the real author is the Cataclysm game engine. The engine decides whether every gunshot hits or misses, whether each zombie evolves sooner or later, and whether or not I will find the items I need or die trying, like Lanny Fiddlesticks did in this season's first episode. So death is real, and it can be sudden and unavoidable. I think I've built up enough anticipation, so let's see what the game throws at us this time. Though it was a relief to speak with other survivors, the people at the refugee center had done little more than confirm Pedro's worst nightmares were real. Some terrible event had proven to have happened across the entire world. It was possible that in some distant haven, civilization still stood, but if anywhere, that must be very far away and impossible for them to reach. It was safest to assume that the refugee center was the last bastion of civilization. They believed there to be other holdout survivors clinging just barely to survival in their homes and apartments, but as the refugees told with much weariness, fewer and fewer were arriving here at the refugee center as the days went on. Pedro had been the most recent newcomer in days. But there was still a missing piece. The people spoke as if the cataclysm had been ongoing for weeks already, but Pedro could only remember back to 4 days. He hadn't questioned them on it, recounting the trauma of the cataclysm's beginning was a wound that was still too fresh. It hadn't scabbed over yet. Many of the survivors were still gripped by horror, and digging at that mental wound would ostracize him from the only good people left alive. But nevertheless, he was having a dawning realization that his mind had forgotten a span of time that lasted weeks of terror, a time span which had brought him to his starting place, that boarded-up house, the first place that he could remember after the cataclysm had begun to unfold. This vacuum of time only served to disturb Pedro further. His mind went to strange places, which could only be filled by the terrible things he could recall. Had he been taken as an alien hostage by what they called the Migo? That biomass resin tower he'd seen yesterday was oddly familiar to him, but was it just his mind playing tricks on him and filling in gaps based on scant evidence? He'd also seen rabid humans overcome with bloodlust, perhaps in an attempt to blend in with the other zombies. What if he had been possessed by the same insanity that they had? Was it an incurable disease, or was it something that could affect anyone at any time? He'd mentioned the unworldly tower to the refugees, who seemed to regard him as a lunatic and quickly changed the topic. Perhaps he was going insane and seeing things that weren't really real, or perhaps the people here were already too terrified to take in what Pedro had seen. He hoped that he was crazy and that he had been the same as the other survivors, just regular people who had escaped or hidden away as the world around them collapsed violently in on itself. But another survivor had told him that nobody else had gaps in their memories, and this caused Pedro a great amount of unease. Rather than let the vacuum of his missing memory eat away at his morale, he decided to go out and try to do something productive with the time and energy he had. He decided that his role in this new community was to do scouting and scavenging. He knew where to get fuel, and he had a motorcycle that he could repair if anything went wrong during a trip. Maybe he could find a camera and take a photo of the alien tower as proof of its existence. After handing out some of the food he had brought with him to the beggars in the lobby, he decided to go fishing. He returned to a fishing spot he'd noticed earlier in the day when he was first traveling to the refugee center. Years ago, while walking a riverside trail, he had witnessed Native Americans spearfishing in a brook during the salmon run. It was a time of season just as fall began, when great numbers of the fish would toss themselves upstream in an attempt to lay their eggs in their spawning place. The smell of the salmon run is unmistakable. Rotting fish carcasses lined the edges of the most fertile rivers. The oldest or weakest salmon often did not make the rigorous journey, their bodies fertilizing the same streams that had first given them life. The other passing salmon often cannibalized their dead cousins. But this wasn't that season, nor was this a brook. It was a dried-up pond, with the few surviving fish desperately seeking escape from the dwindling water. Once, decades ago, this would have been a much larger pond, connected to the Great Lakes through a now extinct waterway. Any thoroughfare had been strangled, and the fish were caught in a shrinking pool, evolutionarily dammed by climactic shift. For these fish, it may have been years or decades of desperation, their olfactory senses telling them that this is the right path, with the right amount of silt and iron, but now the connecting rivers were gone, and their neural pathways led them only to oblivion. The same evolutionary advantages that had carried them through thousands of generations were now a fatal flaw. Fooled by the age of mankind and its blitzkrieg devastation of the natural world, there was nothing for Pedro to do now but make the most of their utter ruin. As he stepped towards the dried-up pond, a small red creature appeared in his peripheral sight. Like an imp, the thing had tiny horns and an impossibly spiraling torso. It scampered towards him. Pedro took no chances whether the thing was real or not and bounded back to the motorcycle, retrieving his Scar-L rifle. His aluminum bat fell to the grass as he aimed back at the red vision, now splishing and splashing its way across the meager pond. He trained his aim on it for as long as possible before the thing neared to the size of a basketball. As he finally squeezed the trigger, he blinked, and all that remained of the imp was a small scatter of red blood. The fish continued to dumbly flounder in the mud, and Pedro clubbed one of them, a channel catfish, to death. He left the remaining two in the pond. If nothing else came to hunt them, Pedro could return tomorrow for another crude harvest. He didn't have a tool to butcher the fish on his bike, so he loaded the catfish onto his motorcycle's rear stowboard and drove south. It seemed that a park trail led through the forest to the lumber mill where his things were stored. On his agile motorbike, he should be able to traverse the forest path and save some time and fuel. As he neared the park trail, he noticed some of those alien plants, the triffids, were nearby. But they were slow, and so long as he kept up pace, he should have no trouble avoiding them while on the path. He rode through, speeding away from the triffids as he pushed on. Not 20 seconds passed between each new rustle that he could hear in the bushes. But at least the plants had little eyesight, and he could keep moving faster than they could react. It wasn't long before he was deep into the thick forest, and the trail became more rough. Young trees had overgrown the trail, and he often found that the only way forward was to accelerate through a bush, crushing it under the heavy wheels. He kept an eye on the condition of the front wheel. It seemed to handle the bushes just fine, and so he continued to press on. With a vine beast behind him, he maneuvered away. What had begun as a straight path had become tangled curves. He was nearly halfway through the woods. Several times he had to reverse, wheeling the motorcycle backwards to get out of a bind. When he was nearly out, he noticed a zombie just ahead of him. He pulled over, lured it into a bush, and killed it with the aluminum bat. Finally, he sighted the road. He pulled out of the thick forest towards the familiar lumber mill, where he had his stockpile of goods. Goods which he'd looted from the block surrounding the apartment building. The forest had been nearly suffocating. He had no intention of taking that route again. With the tools from his car's trunk, he neatly butchered the fish. By the end, there were 11 pounds of catfish fillet, plus a sizable liver. The drippings were left on the ground behind the car, where he'd done his butchering. This fresh meat would keep for another 12 hours, and so he had plenty of time to find a proper stove to cook it on. It was time to take his car, loaded with all his belongings, over to the refugee center, where he would finish preparing the meal. He loaded an extra dozen planks of wood as fuel for his cooking. With everything loaded into the car, which he had freshly refueled, Pedro drove back, this time keeping to the open road. As he arrived at the shelter, he pulled up to the front door and got out, taking his fillets inside. But, as he headed deeper in, searching for any kitchen he could use to cook in, he heard the sounds of fighting. In the garage there was a brawl. As he drew near, he could see 3 survivors fending off 4 zombies, with another 2 zombie corpses already on the ground. Pedro didn't have anything but a wooden plank on him, meant for kindling his cooking, but running back to the car to get a better weapon could cost one of the survivors their life. So he rushed into the garage to help fight back the undead, wielding the plank of wood. As he drew around the corner, he saw one of the refugee center's guards, already dead on the ground. Steps further, and he noticed another dead guard. He shouted, "Help! Zombies in here!" He looked across the dormitory to see haunted, pale faces. They've been through this before. How many times, he didn't know. But none of them were moved to help, and neither did the guards leave their posts. Pedro felt shocked by the lack of organization here. Even though the place was full of people, none of them were cooperating, and now some of them were dead. Pedro only arrived in time to help kill the final zombie. He looked over the wounded survivors as all caught their breaths. All 3 in this room were bleeding from light wounds. Pedro knew that they all had to be looked over to check for infections. This was what the guards were talking about when Pedro had first arrived. When a skirmish breaks out, it's only a matter of time before the disease spreads and spreads more. Any bastion of humanity risks collapse, as the zombie plague spreads from within. The more people, the more risk. Among the corpses, Pedro noticed a zombie brute, an especially strong evolution. What had happened here was that the survivors had quarantined a section of the building, hesitant to kill their former friends and family. But with time, and with my fast evolution settings, the zombies had evolved and broke free from the barricade. Now, another 3 survivors had possibly been infected. Unless the infections were cured, the same would happen again, until the refugee center was completely dead. Pedro had just arrived today. He wasn't about to hold up the survivors. He could only watch as the 3, Vanessa Toby, Leon Nicholas, and Gary Villeneuve, returned to be among the others, clutching their wounds. When he realized that there was no official medic here that would see to the possible infections, Pedro rushed to his car to get his antiseptic and see to the wounds himself. He spotted Gary, his wounds still seeping with blood. Gary's torso was in nearly fatal condition. There was a deep bite here, as well as a bite on his right arm and left leg. Each was deeply wounded, and Pedro felt as if the man would soon be dead. It could be minutes or hours, and he would have to act fast. As the cleaning liquid fizzled over Gary's bloody torso, Pedro realized the dying man was looking at another of the bodies in the room. Gary had been sitting over the corpse of another survivor, whose name he said was Stan. Gary had been related to Stan through his brother-in-law Boris, who he said was also somewhere in the refugee center. Pedro went on to the other two. He had to seek out Vanessa and Leon and assess their conditions as well. Leon was the closest, resting against a wall and covering his wound with one hand. It was simply bleeding lightly, and Leon would survive without any disinfectant required. Vanessa had minor bleeding on her torso, right arm, and left leg. She hadn't been bitten and would very likely survive. Pedro applied his makeshift bandage to her torso, stopping the worst of it and letting the rest heal naturally. Those were the survivors taken care of. There hadn't been any others in the room, and so Pedro felt confident that the infection cascade was properly contained. It still rattled in his mind that there was nobody else in the refugee center who would take on this responsibility. If he wanted the people here to survive, he would have to be vigilant and protect them as best as he could. Cautiously, he headed into the room where the zombies had broken free from. It was unlikely that there would be any zombies here, but he had to make absolutely sure. It was an empty, old dormitory quarter that had been boarded off. Pedro wondered cynically whether the people inside had been still alive when the barricade was put up. He rifled through some things, stealing a set of Prussian blue radiation tablets, as well as a driving handbook. If the guards had spotted him, they might consider it stealing, but Pedro felt no special respect for them at this point, seeing how they had left the people in the dormitory alone to fend for themselves or die. The place looked clear. He went into a kitchen off the inhabited dormitory and set his fish fillets out, filling the oven with planks from the destroyed barricade. The fillets were cooked. It was time for him to hand them out to whoever was hungry. The people in the inner parts of the refugee center seemed to be well fed. Pedro headed out to the lobby entrance, where the people who were prevented from entering the building stayed. Each of them received a cooked fillet, and Pedro felt pretty good about himself. This place needed somebody like Pedro, somebody who cared enough to look over the wounded and get food for the people who couldn't do that themselves. But he couldn't help but think of the people who died today. They died because of the lack of care that the organizers of this place showed. Maybe soon, he would go up to the second floor and confront whoever was in charge and figure out what was going on. But that's enough for this episode. I'm really excited to see what happens as we transition from a solo survival story into one that includes the characters from the refugee center. Each of the characters has their own backstory and personality, which is really impressive. I'm torn between detailing them for the series or glossing over some of it for when you play the game yourself. I'll likely take a long-range view, following the general storyline while not spoiling specific characters. We'll see what happens. I'm envisioning Pedro to have a sense of justice. He's not a desperate survivor, he's a capable guy. He managed to club dozens of zombies to death all on his own, and now he's equipped with guns and vehicles. We won't have to struggle, at least until the zombies start to evolve faster than Pedro can adapt. This next arc will be fun, because I think I'll have a lot of control over choosing what happens. But my vision of Pedro as the post-apocalyptic hero is what's going to guide me. We'll see where this goes. I'd love to be able to recruit some companions if we can find any while scouting. With all that said, I eagerly anticipate the next episode of Tales from the Final Day, where we'll see how Pedro survives his first night in the refugee center.